if we don't have sticks, if we don't have, an organized labor bloc that can withhold votes, if there is some reluctance to publicly rebuke candidates or particular actions that candidates have, because it feels empty, like there's nothing we can do because we don't have a stick, then what hope is there of any kind of outside strategy?
Well, I think we do have sticks, but I'll let them. Yeah, I should let Sean jump in, but one thing I want to get into is just the fact that there's another layer that we're not discussing, which is the constituents, which is the actual mass base, a lot of them latent and not politicized. So in other words, the activist kind of swarm, and the DSA members are two of these actors, and then there's the big national politicians, but then there's also the constituents, the future basis for our politics, which is different than the activists either inside or outside DSA. And these people have a direct relationship to figures like AOC and Bernie Sanders. So it's not just that you risk alienating a few politicians, which I don't mind, but you risk potentially not having the conduit to their base. And I think that's the tricky thing. You I for example, was, I think, by the scale of left institutional media, among the more sympathetic people to force the vote, for instance, as a tactic, in part because I think my idea is, why not? Because I think we've exhausted our last kind of wave of struggle, and this wave of struggle in many ways started with Occupy, or Wisconsin before that, but Occupy. And I thought Occupy was a stupid idea at the time. I went to the protest and I'm like, these anarchists are trying to do what they did to the New School Library, to a bunch of parks all around the country. Is this really going to work? And in many ways it did. It opened up many, many years of productive struggle. So now is, I think, a time for tactical flexibility. It's a time for just throwing stuff at the wall. I don't think there's a tremendous price to pay for these things, and I've been wrong before. And I think a lot of socialists need to acknowledge that the theoretical and intellectual kind of impulse behind this big opening actually came from anarchists and came from Adbusters, stupid publication, which did this incredible thing.
We're gonna clip that
100 times greater than what Jacobin has accomplished. So.
Well, it's Karl Rove, to quote Karl Rove, political capital, he says, isn't something you can grow interest on in a bank. You have to spend it or it goes away. And I think that there was a lot of talk about, we're going to lose political capital over force the vote. And it wasn't clear what that meant or what that looked like, especially when there was no spending plan, there was no alternative presented for what they were going to do with that political capital anyway. Sean?
Yeah, I barely paid attention to the force the vote thing, but I paid attention enough to see that there were commenters going around on Twitter saying that Jimmy Dore represents the working class in this country. When he gets up there and says force the vote, which to me just goes to show how different the world is out there compared to what people think on twitter.com about what the working class wants and what the working class needs, or even how the working class even interfaces with politics. I don't know really much at all about DSA internal politics, but these types of discussions, I think, unfortunately or fortunately, are on this sort of abstract plane for most people who hate politicians, who have never imagined that either political party could do much for them, and probably don't know the difference between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden when it comes to most of the issues. And the question that I think is when people give shit to the DSA, they say the DSA are just a bunch of urban, yuppie, overeducated kids playing at socialist politics. And I say no. The way that I understand the DSA and what folks are trying to do in that is that DSA is a particular constituency of people who have come together into this organization in order to achieve certain things. But the DSA isn't the Socialist Party. It's not the Communist Party. It's not going to end up containing all of the energy of a socialist or communist, a working class party. What we have to see is that certain groups do well working on some, it's a division of labor, right? Like I would love to see a situation where there was some sort of young, youthful, militant type organization similar to DSA that was in my sector, in the building trades, and fighting and coordinating amongst one another on the ground in the unions and outside the unions in order to coordinate militancy for workers' struggles. And so I think that I think a lot of the discussion seems very abstract to people who aren't paying attention to it. And I think that we need to start focusing on like the real day-to-day issues that affect people's lives. And if we want to build that hammer, if we want to build that lever for affecting politicians, I think nothing's more powerful than having built a grassroots labor movement.
So Sean, I will push. So I just want to push back against one thing you said there,
sure,
which is that when people say that Jimmy Dore, not that I saw that particular strain of comment, but I think that a lot of folks found Jimmy Dore to be relatable because while one camp was talking about the abstraction of political will or political capital, Jimmy Dore was talking about how he lost 6 inches off his height because he had a back surgery, that he wasn't able to get medical attention for, and basically his spine collapsed, and how he had a very personal experience with not being able to afford healthcare. And the people that listen to his show and a lot of people who come on his show find the anger that he brings to the issue to be commensurate with the level of anger we should all collectively have. And that what felt really out of touch was the disconnect between the Bernie himself, the squad running around for the last 2 years talking about what an exigent crisis everything was, including healthcare. And then in the force the vote moment saying, we're not even going to attempt at this policy. So it wasn't, he represents the working class because he's literally, labors alongside us, but because he at least is speaking with the exigency of someone who has had firsthand experience with the issues on the table as opposed to talking about them as abstractions.
Yeah, and what I would just say to what I think you're bringing up, which is one of the things that I flagged on my very small friend Facebook group, but actually an NPC member said to him it was very important, and he ended up writing a newsletter about it, was like, I said that while I disagreed with Force the Vote, what it showed me was that as someone who had sat at coalition tables around Medicare for All, there was terrible communication between national partners and the grassroots groups that I had been doing as political director of Our Revolution, like working with chapters to do lobby visits. But it was any reasonable person would have no idea that was happening and that work was happening. And I said that what Force the Vote showed me, even though I disagree with it tactically and strategically, I said it showed that there were people who could fairly say, I have no idea what DSA, what Our Revolution, what Center for Popular Democracy, what People's Action are doing day to day to get Medicare for All done. And I think that's, when you're talking about the inside-outside, going full circle back to what you're saying, is like that's what happens when you're too inside. And when there's actually a funny reason DSA has never had its full national headquarters in D.C. And I asked once, and they said, because when you're in D.C., you become self-important, and you lose real touch. Not that New York's that much better, but it was an interesting point.
Don't get smug, Virgil.
But it was an interesting point that, all these same nonprofit leaders talk to each other, and they lose touch about how much people actually are communicating with the base and how well they're doing it. So I just want to throw that out there, that I think it's an organizing question for both sides about how do you reach the people who do have legitimate desires to want to get Medicare for All, which is millions of people. Even though I agree, if you knock on a door and talk to most workers, they won't know what Medicare for All is, but they want healthcare reform, and show them what people are actually doing. And people couldn't honestly tell you what people were doing, even though I know they were working very hard.
But there's a fundamental, I think, misunderstanding about what a spectacle does. So in other words, part of this is about issue salience, right? So we all know people or ourselves have suffered with the American healthcare system. Obviously, everybody feels passionately about that. People in DSA, people outside DSA, who are on the left broadly feel passionate about that. But right now, all these crises are personal crises. So part of what having a big spectacle does is it doesn't immediately get it done or bring Medicare for All to America. But what it does is it takes it from the background and makes this a foregrounded issue. So instead of talking about how Biden's press secretary is going to restore trust in the government and us talk about like decency in politics and whatever else. Not that I'm against all those things. We're going to talk about healthcare. Like now is the time we're going to talk about healthcare, and we don't care that the wealthiest 50-60% of the country, or at least 30-40% of the country is content with their healthcare. We want to talk about it now, and I think that there was almost both sides were talking past each other in the sense that some of the forced to vote people were hyperbolically saying, I think, that AOC and other people were standing in the way of healthcare. But then the response from other parts of the institutional left, including from quarters around Jacobin, DSA, and whatever, was just to zero in on that and say, oh, this isn't a realistic view of politics. But I think, in fact, there was something more realistic about recognizing that we're in a total impasse and we need to figure out a way to make our issues that we could win on in the future salient today.